Okay, what's good, everybody? Welcome back to Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs. Today we have a dope ass episode as usual. Today we're going to be from this textbook, which we can get into the lore of. We're going to be talking about a essay by Seneca on the happy life. So we're going to talk about a ton of stuff. He's one of the OG GOAT Stoic philosophers. This is a fantastic essay. I remember I read this in undergrad. This is what put me on to Seneca in the first place, as well as Stoicism in general. We got a bunch of other texts we're going to be talking about. We're busting out some big gun. We got Siddhartha, we got Cicero, we got Plato, we got the Upanishads, you name it. So I'm very hyped to be talking about this essay today. So if this interests you, pop a squat and we finna get into it. This time I already got my tea brewed. I'm gonna just let chat filter in. In fact, let me make sure I actually did this correctly. I believe I did. So okay, cool. As per tradition, as everybody's funneling in, yes, what's up, cool coat, a regular. As people are funneling, I can talk about what I have been reading. So, as usual, I don't have with me. It's right over there. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Hitler has invaded Poland. The funny thing, too, that my takeaway from like what I've read since the last week is just how human it all is, in the sense that, like, before Hitler invaded Poland, there were all these, like, last-minute negotiations taking place with, like, some of the biggest diplomats in some of the biggest, world powers in Europe, and they were just racing about and, like, literally waking each other up at like 2-3 a.m. trying to figure out a deal. And of course it didn't go through, and Hitler had plans to invade Poland the whole time, essentially. But it was just funny to kind of see, not funny, but just like behind the scenes of history there, the fate of World War II, and just therefore the history of the world was confined to just like these total last minute scramble. So that's just fun little reading. I've also started Midnight's Children by Salman Rushdie, and I'm pretty early into it, but it's so far it's really interesting. There's kind of like low-key some like magical vibes. It's also about the main character is like born at the precise instant that India gains its independence, and so far it seems like there's going to be some stuff related to that. But the writing is also just it's very engaging so far, if I may say so myself. So, curious what others are reading in the chat, if you guys feel like you want to share. And I'm going to take a little sip, and then we can kind of just get into it. Okay, so like I said, we are going to be talking about this essay on the happy life by Seneca. And I thought in the Discord I posted the PDF. I thought there was a nice little biography of Seneca and Stoicism, so I'm going to just kind of read through this. Shrimp Bits, what's up? First time chatter, reading more Sagan, of course, and then 10 Myths About Israel by Ilan Pape. Okay, nice. That sounds fire. What Sagan are you reading? I'm curious. But any Sagan is good as far as Big Nate is concerned. That's good to hear. So yeah, while we're doing that, I'm gonna just go through this bio. So Lucius Annaeus Seneca, I believe he is Seneca the Younger, not to be confused with Seneca the Older or Seneca the Middle-Aged. That was stupid. But okay, born in Spain, was a Roman philosopher, dramatist, and statesman who served as a teacher and influential advisor to Nero. So one thing about these Stoicism mofos, like for instance, here I got bro right here, Cicero, they were multifaceted. Like Seneca, as he says, was like an actual statesman. Cicero was a lawyer. He was a praetor. That is to say, he was like one of the highest ranking government officials, as far as I understand, in Roman civilization. And in the meantime, they'd be dropping fire philosophy. And maybe it's because those two are related. Maybe the two are not. They're entangleable away from each other. On contact from now. Okay, yeah, or for now. Nice. I haven't read that. Seneca is really legit. Oh wait, okay, hold on. I'm a mod here. Hold on, I'm allow it. Okay. Seneca is really. That's funny. Cool code. By the way, it just like I had to mod your chat because it said blew me away. Like it says may contain sexual. Seneca blew you away. Big fan, especially after this essay. The first few letters on ethics. Yeah, and I've talked about on my other channel on the shortness of life, which is just another all-time banger. So, he also was an influential advisor to Nero, which is a bit of a callback in some ways to David Foster Wallace, who compared the lobster festival in Maine as like this horrible torture fest by someone like Nero. So look at that, look at the little synchronicity. I said, look, the readings are tying into each other. Look at that. But I thought this was a nice little description of Stoicism as well. So he says, Seneca was an early advocate of Stoicism, according to which happiness requires living in accord with reason, putting aside desires and fears, accepting with tranquility whatever may be the outcome of events, and willingly doing one's duty. I felt like that was actually a pretty good description. Also, real quick, I was gonna post a little announcement on my Instagram, and then I moved my phone so I wasn't distracted. Let me go get that real quick. Let me go get that. Gotta let the people know. Gotta let the people know. So let me just post that. I'm sure they're gonna come flooding in now, right? Come flooding in. Okay, just gonna make sure that goes. But anyhow, I gotta do my due diligence. All right, cool. So without further ado, okay, so yeah, we're just gonna get right into it. I think this essay is best gone through just going passage by passage, and there's just so many little gems in this essay that I think are going to give us plenty to think about. And this is one of those essays, to be honest, I hadn't read it since. So my background with this is I had like a class on the philosophy of happiness when I was getting my philosophy minor, and I remember this essay really sticking out to me. And I'm like, I wanted to revisit it, and I started reading the first couple of pages, and I'm like, all right, this is reading club material, so I threw it up there. But this was like my first time coming back to it in many years, and I remember it having a big impact on me then, and I still think it's absolutely true now. By the way, I think my camera and my mic are good, but of course you already know. Let me know if not. Let me turn myself down just a wee bit. I'll be talking. Okay, cool. So hopefully anybody here will be able to, you either read it, or if not, you'll be able to get some banger life advice. Okay, good. Thank you, Cool Cult. Okay, so let's just get started with the first paragraph. To live happily, my brother Gallio. I'm gonna have to pause right there. I'm gonna have to pause right here, because the fact that this text takes the place of a letter, and so much of Stoicism, apparently from what I've read at least, some of the most fire texts are letters. The great Cicero essay on the practical code of ethics and duties, that was a letter to his son. On the shortness of life, that was a letter to like his stepfather, or no, I don't think it was quite that, but it was a letter. And here we go again on the happy life, to his brother Gallio. That's the thing about letter writing too. That art has completely died, and I wish it hadn't, because who knows how many Stoic treatises might have come out of this. But anyhow, I digress. To live happily, my brother Gallio, is the desire of all men, but their minds are blinded to a clear vision of just what it is that makes life happy. And so far from its being easy to attain the happy life, the more eagerly a man strives to reach it, the farther he recedes from it if he has made a mistake in the road. For when it leads him in the opposite direction, his very speed will increase the distance that separates him. And so just kind of planting the seed, kind of like breaking that down a little bit, but also he's going to start this essay off by basically pointing out that happiness, arguably, right, is one of the most important things in our life, right? Like, what is more important in life than being happy? And yet it's something that, how many of anyone watching this right now, how much time have you really devoted to really thinking about what it is that leads to a happy and fulfilling life? And so he's kind of just laying that whole thing out here, right? The more eagerly a man strives to reach it, the farther he recedes if he has made a mistake in the road. So thinking about at a high level in terms of philosophy, what does make a happy life, that's first step, right? So you can set your course so that once you're on the right path, you're going the right way. Because even like in real life, if you have a ship and you're off by 2 or 3 degrees over long distances, that really small change can end up in a totally different place in the world. And so we're taking that analogy here to really get an understanding of what is it really that leads to a happy life. So Cool Cult, the fact that these are letters are interesting. In the case of the letters on ethics, ooh, that was weird, my thing just tweaked. And in the case of the letters on ethics, I think it's debated whether there was actually a person he was corresponding with. Oh yeah, I could see that too. Like the letter was just an excuse to write the thing. But yeah, no, the art of letter writing is unfortunately dead. Because even just, okay, to go on a little tangent, when me and my girl were first courting each other, we were texting and calling and stuff, but we would also just write letters. And that whole process really was a whole different form, like medium of, just like, basic communication, but just like thinking, like the types of things that would come up are not normal things that would come up otherwise if we were just, texting or calling. But anyhow, So, first, therefore, we must seek what it is we are aiming at. Then we must look about for the road by which we can reach it most quickly. But so long as we wander aimlessly, having no guide, and following only the noise and discordant cries of those who call us in different directions, life will be consumed in making mistakes. Life that is brief, even if we should strive day and night for sound wisdom. So as long as we are listening to the rabble, the noise and discordant cries of society in certain ways, it's going to pull us this way, it's going to pull us this way. We're just going to be wandering aimlessly, having no guide, and until eventually our life will be consumed in making mistakes. A life, as he says, that is already, even if we spend day and night looking for it, already so short in terms of, getting this sound wisdom. So it will do us well to give a little bit of high level thinking about what it is that actually makes us happy. And he points out, in the conditions of our journey, the journey of finding out what makes a happy life. What's good, Washing Toad TV? Good to see y'all back. Good to see y'all back. For the conditions of this journey are different than of most travel. On most journeys, some well-recognized road and inquiries made of the inhabitants of the region prevent you from going astray. But on this one, all the best beaten and the most frequented paths are the most deceptive. Nothing therefore needs to be emphasized than the warning that we should not, like sheep, follow the lead of the throng. So here he's kind of planting the seed of an idea that he's going to go on this whole little tangent on. One idea is, on a journey, right? We're talking about getting to this destination. How best should we reach the journey of living a happy life? He says naturally, on a normal journey, you do the most beaten path road, right? You ask the locals. There's clearly a path that's been traveled. Robert Frost. I took the whatever, you understand. I forget what his quote is, but the road less traveled, etc., etc. But in this case, and he's going to kind of talk about why, going with the majority is actually the most deceptive. We should not, like sheep, follow the lead of the throng. And he's going to get into a bit of that why. Yeah, cool, Cole. I agree. The prose goes crazy. This is one of my first, honestly, I think, experiences realizing that philosophy can be genuinely rhetorical and literary in that sense. And there's so many also in this tradition, like Nietzsche, Schopenhauer. I mean, there's just, the list goes on. But Seneca, and I think just the Stoics in general, have Marcus Aurelius, Cicero. They all are really good at implementing really lyrical, rhetorical language when they're talking about these ideas. So, okay, he's talking about, again, he's going to have this little critique of, following the majority. It is the example of other people that is our undoing. Let us merely separate ourselves from the crowd and we shall be made whole. And so we see the same thing happening that happens at the elections, where when the fickle breeze of popular favor has shifted, the very same persons who chose the praetors wonder that those praetors were chosen. The same thing has one moment our favor, the next our disfavor. This is the outcome of every decision that follows the majority. And I'm also reminded of a Schopenhauer quote where he talks about public opinion, basically the majority public opinion, is like newspaper flying in the wind. 1 second it's going this way, the other, it's totally fickle and arbitrary, and it changes just as quickly as it comes to a decision. So clearly, following the majority is something that we should not do in the case of happiness, in our quest, our philosophical quest for what makes a happy life. When the happy life is under debate, there will be no use for you to reply to me as if it were a matter of votes. This side seems to be in a majority, for that is just the reason it is the worst side. Human affairs are not so happily ordered that the majority prefer the better things. A proof of the worst choice is the crowd. Therefore, let us find what is best to do, not what is most commonly done. Again, just this idea, the majority, the masses, the sheep. I mean, we find instances of this in popular culture as well. But typically what the mass hive mind is thinking is not going to be what's best. That's oftentimes kind of the lowest denominator. This is where you'll get like the basest, the types of people who are unreflective about their lives. Gotta follow the beat to your own drum, man. I mean, that's exactly what he is saying, and I'm glad to hear you enjoyed the essay. And we got to march to the beat of our own drum when it comes to happiness, and we're gonna get into this too. But when we look to what the majority of people think makes you happy, like having like lots of wealth, having the highest status, all these different things, we're gonna find that they're really quite empty, and do not have any substantive. It's nothing substantive in which we can stake the happiness of our lives. And then he just kind of has this fun little line that, when he's talking about the rabble, the majority, he says, I mean no less the servants of the court than the servants of the kitchen, for I do not regard the color of the garments that clothe the body. In rating a man, I do not rely upon eyesight. I have a better and surer light by which I may distinguish the false from the true. Let the soul discover the good of the soul. This is just a passage that I really liked the rhetorical, literary nature of it. But, in this case, it doesn't, you could have the highest academic, you could have the highest, court noble with the nicest garments, right? At the end of the day, let the soul discover the good of the soul. I thought that was a nice little line. And so this, the critique of the majority applies just as much to the peasant as it does to the high aristocrat. So instead of this, right, why do we not rather seek some real good, one which I could feel, not one which I could display? These things that draw the eyes of men outwardly glitter, but are worthless within. Let us seek something that is good in more than appearance, that is solid, constant, and more beautiful in its more hidden part. And again, I really love this line, let's seek something, a real good, one that we can actually feel, a happiness that we actually experience and live, rather than one that we can display. If you have like the flashy cars, the trophy wife, the wealth, all that kind of stuff that society tends to think of as like the symbols of what would be happiness, especially in like a capitalist society. These are things that ultimately don't make us truthfully happy. We don't, as he said, we don't have the feeling of happiness. These are things that we can display unto others. And so, there is going to be no solid base for a true form of happiness if we invest in things that are purely for display. And, so how do we get this? He says, it is placed not far off. You will find it. You need only to know where to stretch out your hand. As it is, just as if we groped in darkness, we pass by things near at hand, stumbling over the very objects we desire. So achieving this real, true, foundational happiness, it's not far off. In fact, it's going to be found within, as we shall see. And it, as he says too, just as in a dark room, if you're in the darkness, if you have not thought about these ideas critically, philosophically, you might pass over the very thing in which you're looking for, which again is going to be this sort of internal source of happiness. So as he says, the happy life is a life that is in harmony with its own nature. And he just kind of, wait, can you guys can still see me? My thing turned off. You guys can see me? I think so. Yeah, okay, weird. My camera's doing so. All right, let me know if you can. Okay, cool. Thank you. Appreciate it. My little display turned off, but okay, anyway. So the happy life, harmony with its own nature, and just general, he has this like list. We have a sound mind, one that is in constant possession of its sanity. That's the thing, having full critical faculties, a discipline and austerity when it comes to, dealing with your mind. It has to be courageous and energetic. That's another thing too. The Stoics are all about their honor. Capable of the noblest fortitude, ready for every emergency, careful of the body, but without anxiety. Lastly, it must be attentive to all the advantages that adorn him, but without over love for none. The user, but not the slave of the gifts of fortune. Once we have driven away all that excites or affrights us, there ensues unbroken tranquility and enduring freedom, for when pleasures and fears have been banished. And so I love this too, grateful and attentive to all the advantages that adorn life, but without overmuch love for none. That's another thing too. The Stoics are all about embracing and appreciating what we actually have, no matter your circumstance in life, because that's completely up to the whims of fortune. And the real Stoic attitude is being able to find inner harmony in all things. So for one, and this is true in Meditations, I was like kind of looking for some quotes. I wasn't able to find that one specifically, but he basically is like, when you wake up, first thing I do is just think about all the good things that are, I have my health, I have the sanity of my mind, I'm not in any, crazy situation. And I think that's something that all of us can kind of benefit from. I think we've all had that perspective shift where, you know, you're having like a shitty day, but then you kind of get a real glimpse of like, you know, that's real pain, that's real suffering, and it kind of puts your own into perspective. That's something that I think the Stoics would kind of emphasize. Just being grateful for the things that you do have, and all this other thing, having a sound control of your mind, not being the slave to your own mind, which I think he would say the majority of people are, and which we'll kind of like, you know, talk about. The user, but not the slave to the gifts of fortune. Man, oh yeah, crazy how this is from 2,000 years ago. Yeah, I know. That's something that constantly, that's one of the things that I'm attributing as a reason to like, and especially now, like why I love literature. There is just such a wealth of just life advice and insight that it really is this almost magical thing, which we've talked about before, where it's like, it's just crazy that someone in a completely different context and time setting is able to speak just so precisely about our own modern experience. Accordance with nature, breaking from the crowd, self-investigation, proper orientation towards pain and pleasure. These seem to be theme across the most knowing figures from what I've seen, be it Stoicism, philosophy, spirituality. Yeah, I love that cool cult, and I think we'll talk about a lot of that with books like these. And, you know, there's so many more, but, you know, we got like Hinduism, we have ancient Greek philosophy, we have Roman, and then we have like, you know, a little modern. And this is just kind of ones that were coming off the top of my head. So yeah, I agree. There are these themes that start popping up, and this is also an interesting question too when it comes to like, you know, truth in literature. You know, there's like often, and this is another thing we've been talking about on the channel, but, you know, people who say there's nothing valuable in fiction or things like this because there's no facts, there's no information, it's all just, you know, it's just art, right? There's no use to it. But this is one of the great things, like you find that across all these different traditions, there are the same motifs and themes about what makes for a meaningful existence, which I think really does speak to some kind of genuine truth about, you know, human life. Okay, let me take a little sip break. But yeah, I agree with all you guys. And this, yeah, fantastic essay. Okay, so where were we? So he's just talking about, you know, once you are able to cast off all the whims of fortune and all the pleasures and fears, there comes upon us first a boundless joy that is firm and unalterable, then peace and harmony of the soul, and true greatness coupled with kindliness, for all ferocity is born from weakness. This is going to be a thing that he's going to talk about too. It's just, once you do pursue this life of virtue and happiness and everything, it comes with it this boundless joy, firm and unalterable, a peace and harmony of the soul. And I think this is also so true, like we're kind of talking about. If you look across all these traditions, any kind of contemplative, meditative, spiritual, philosophical, the people that really go deep within, they just seem to like radiate a peacefulness and contentedness, a happiness, you could say, a happiness. So a man thus grounded must necessarily be attended by constant cheerfulness and a joy that is deep and issues from deep within, since he finds delight in his own resources and desires no joys greater than his inner joys. So yeah, again, exactly what we were talking about. Ferocity is born from weakness. I missed that. Yeah, I thought that was there's so many lines in here that I'm not even going to be able to get to just because he has like little tangents that are fantastic. But I agree, another great line, like when you're angry, and just any kind of ferocity is ultimately born of like some kind of self-consciousness, some kind of weakness of the soul. And yeah, I mean, you could just break down that whole line just in and of itself. But yeah, I mean, I'm even reminded of Siddhartha when he sees Gautama, when he sees the Buddha. I forget exactly what he's called in this book, but when he sees the Buddha, he sees that he's just radiating like this inner happiness down to like the knuckle bones, he says. I forget exactly what the line was, but this is someone that you could just tell almost literally was like, you know, radiating this happiness. And I think that's what Seneca is talking about here. You know, this happiness deep within, desires no greater than his inner joys. The day a man becomes superior to pleasure, he will also be superior to pain. But you see in what wretched and baneful bondage he who must linger, whom pleasures and pains, he must linger, whom pleasures and pains, those most capricious and tyrannical of masters shall in turn enslave. Therefore we must make our escape to freedom. But the only means of procuring this is through indifference to fortune. the great and stable joy that comes from the discovery of truth, and a joy which springs from a good that is his own. So again, I love this too. The day a man becomes superior to pleasure, he will also be superior to pain. These are two sides of the same coin. The wheel of samsara is related to both pleasure and suffering, and the two are interrelated. Like with pleasure, even when you get something that feels really good, feels really pleasurable, there's always this feeling of I want more, right? You need more. You become insatiable for it, and then once those pleasures are taken away, you are completely depraved, right? Like you start tweaking out because you're not. Basically, the absence of those pleasures is in itself a form of suffering. So that's what he means, I think, by once you transcend, once you become superior to pleasure, you will also be superior to pain. You're sort of drawing within all these external circumstances, these external conditions, and finding a more stable source in one's own self. For so far as sensual pleasure is concerned, though it flows about us on every side, steals in through every opening, softens the mind with its blandishments, and employs one resource after another in order to seduce us in whole or in part, yet who of mortals, if he has left in him one trace of a human being, would choose to have his senses tickled night and day, and, forsaking the mind, devote his attention wholly to the body? And this is kind of just putting into perspective, right? There's like the seeking external pleasures and fortunes and things like that versus the internal joy. He's basically saying, who in their right mind would, with these sensual pleasures, make us soft and they steal in through every opening, right? Who in their right mind would give up the faculty of their mind and their conscious thinking, like the philosophical, higher, lofty thoughts about, what makes a person happy? Who would give that up purely so that they could have a life that is just the senses are tickled night and day? It's almost like dystopian. And again, I'm embarrassed I haven't read it, but I know the premise of Brave New World. I'm pretty sure it's something like this, where it's like you just completely hook yourself up to a pleasure machine, essentially, at the cost of having. I mean, we really do this in the people who are constantly scrolling on social media, just engaging in totally mindless but kind of like pleasurable activity, although it's really not. Like, I like hot Cheetos, I like ice cream, I like TV, I like social media, but if I'm doing that for too long, this is also what he means by pleasure is related to pain. Like if you're just scrolling for an hour, 2 hours, that's a really a horrible feeling, but it's the dopamine pleasure and blah 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 blah. But yeah, just pointing out that nobody would give up the sanity of their own mind just so that they could have their senses tickled, as he says. And as he also says, no man can be happy unless he is sane, and no man can be sane who searches for what will injure him in place of what is best. The happy man, therefore, is one who has right judgment. The happy man is content with his present lot, no matter what it is, and is reconciled to his circumstances. So again, kind of like what we were just talking about. No man can be happy unless he is sane, and nobody is sane who, for instance, would choose a life just full of pleasures at the expense of these more deep and spiritual ideals. The happy man, therefore, is one who has right judgment, is content with his present lot, no matter what it is. Because as he says, it's the happy man must be one who is sane. And when you think about it, is it not insane to stake the happiness of your life on the whims of fortune, on the wheel of fortune? That's where Wheel of Fortune comes from. That's the original almost like medieval idea. It comes up and down. It just goes round and round and round, the wheels of fortune. So, and that's the Buddhism idea to a T. Like that's another huge parallel, I think, with Stoicism. And I think historically they may even have some overlap and some crosstalk. But this, this idea of samsara, this endless cycle of suffering, you would be an insane person, in the sense that he's kind of talking about, to stake your happiness on something as fickle as that. The similarities between this and what the Buddha was teaching is crazy. Yeah, I mean, honestly, to me, it's almost just like mysticism in general. A lot of these, and like how we were talking about, all these cultures, these deep thinkers, philosophers, everything like that, they really do. Buddhism, I think, was just one of the first to kind of get to it and independently, and they have their whole own wonderful tradition. But yeah, this is something that constantly surprises me, is how deep the principles of Buddhism run across so many different types of thinking. This part is so huge. Satisfaction with one's lot despite a lack of comfort or access to pleasure. Yep. Yeah, exactly. And, I'm reminded of another Stoic philosopher. I believe his name is Epictetus, and he was a slave, and the whole thing was, what's the quote? You can make a heaven or hell of the mind, something like that. But even in, abject circumstances, and this is almost, man's search for meaning type shit. One day in the life of Ivan Denisovich, these are people who are living in concentration camps, and yet they are finding a way to find spiritual fulfillment, and it's, now that we're talking about this, there's even a line in Man's Search for Meaning where he's basically like, in the concentration camps, you have control over nothing. You are absolutely subject in every single way to what the guards say, except for one thing, and that is, of course, the quality of one's own mind. So yeah, I agree. It's so huge, and too, especially just, this is the kind of stuff that I take with me in like my everyday day-to-day life. This is the kind of stuff that really changes my perspective. Like, what do you think you can go the rest of your life just living, completely no difficulties? Everything's just going to go smoothly. It's going to be pleasure all along the way. You're not going to encounter any suffering, anything like that. That's ridiculous. As he said, no man can be happy unless he is sane, and no man can be sane who searches who would stake their life and believe that. So yeah, great stuff here. I wonder if they were smoking doobies back then to expand their consciousness. I want to do a video on this soon. Dream blunt rotation. I think Seneca would Seneca be in your guys' dream blunt rotation? I think so. Cicero too. Plato as well. I mean, all of these would be fantastic. But yeah, I can't imagine. You know how it's like, what would you do if you could go back in history? Go back, smoke a blunt with Plato, or maybe Socrates. So yeah, great questions here. Great questions. So okay, now he's going to talk about too this idea of the relationship between pleasure and virtue, because what the Stoics talk about is virtue, doing goodness, and honestly, in my experience, virtue is never really fully defined, but I do think, and also with the way in which Stoics talk about reason, that's another huge theme running throughout this text, following within reason. But all of these to me are just living in accordance with nature, just generally. Like when you do when you're in a situation, you oftentimes know what you really ought to do, right? And we don't always live up to that. But I think that's what he's talking about with virtue, pursuing the good, whatever that is. And it's going to be case by case. And I don't think there's really any definite definition of it. It's more like it, and maybe more importantly, you feel it when you see it. So even those who declare that the highest good is in the belly see in what a dishonorable position they have placed it. And so they say it is not possible to separate pleasure from virtue, and they aver that no one can live virtuously without also living pleasantly, nor pleasantly without also living virtuously. So this is a kind of critique that, wait, hold on, bro, the virtue part had me confused. Did he mean morals or good traits? That's the thing, Washington. That's what I meant by I don't think it's ever really fully defined. I try to just give my best interpretation of what they mean by virtue, living in accordance with nature, doing the right thing, doing what in your soul you really ought to be doing. So he talks about this false equivalency that people have kind of critiques of, where it's like, oh, virtue and pleasure and virtue, these are the same things. And he even, they would say something like, you live virtuously because it brings you pleasure. Therefore, anytime that I feel pleasure, I'm also acting virtuously. That's kind of like this fallacious reasoning that people will kind of give in response to all this, which he's going to promptly, break down. And I think the way I think Seneca would answer all this is that virtue can give rise to pleasure, but that does not mean pleasure entails virtue. So yeah, kindness, generosity, yeah, right. The word definitions are a bit tough, nature, reason, etc. Kind of need tangential background on Stoics. Not to mention, the translations. That's a huge deal. This is translated from, ancient Rome. And even things like with Plato, the good, and logos, and techne. There's these words, and we do our best to kind of define them, but I don't think there's a one-to-one definition of what they were talking about then necessarily, and how that translates to today. I almost kind of just go off of context clues. Like when Seneca here, I can't give you a specific precise definition, but when Seneca here is talking about virtue, I kind of understand, just at least at an intuitive level, what he means. So I'll take a drink. But this is good. There's some great conversation here. All right. So then Seneca poses the question, of course, what reason is there, I beg of you, why pleasure cannot be separated from virtue? If the two really were inseparable, we should not see certain things pleasant, but not. Wait, hold up. My bad, hold up. But if the two were inseparable, we should not see certain things pleasant, but not honorable, and certain things truly most honorable, but painful and capable of being accomplished only through suffering. So just kind of breaking down this equivalency. And I know as I understand it, this was kind of a common thing, a retort back then. There was like a whole school of philosophy, which he's going to talk about, like the Epicurean philosophy, which is like happiness in life is all about pleasures. And there's some nuance there, which we will talk about. But there was a whole school of philosophy that's like you should indulge in all these kinds of like, physical, sensual things. Like, you can do so in the picture of Dorian Gray is, I think, a good example of what that Epicurean philosophy and why limit yourself to any kind of sensual experience? Like, isn't a freedom and proliferation of new experiences, especially if they're pleasurable, isn't that a good thing? And there's there's a line, I forget who said it, but it's like, pleasure may not be like the best thing, but at least it feels good all the while. Like I forget what it is. I butchered that, but. Anyway, so he's just kind of breaking down that whole school of thought. The two, right, if they were inseparable, there should not be things that are pleasant but dishonorable, like sitting on the couch, eating hot Cheetos, and watching TV. That might be like kind of pleasurable, but clearly that's like not honorable. So that's an instance where they're kind of dissociable. And then you have things, of course, which are most honorable but painful and capable of being accomplished only through suffering. Like when, I actually don't know exactly, but I know this was like happened back in the day. But let's just take, for example, because I'm pretty sure this happened. When Copernicus was burned at the stake for putting, the real heliocentric model of the universe, right? That wasn't pleasant, but it was honorable. So it was virtuous, you could say, right? This is somebody who sacrificed their life in the pursuit of truth. But by no means was getting burnt alive at the stake pleasurable. So you have these two instances, right? There is no false. Virtue is not pleasure. Pleasure is not virtue. There may be some relationships. But if anything, it's one directional. Virtue, as he kind of has been talking about, is sure to give you a pleasure in the sense that it's like this deep-seated, issued joy. Whereas pleasure never necessarily gives rise or entails virtue. It may be wrong, but I've heard that hedonists are misinterpreted and actually have a sophisticated idea of pleasure, and it not being synonymous with indulgence. Yeah, and I think we'll talk about that, because he basically is like, some of you guys may disagree with me, but Epicurus is actually right. The way he defines pleasure is very much in line with Stoic philosophy. So I agree. And, it all comes down, and this is an interesting question, which I don't know how fully we can really get into in this talk, but pleasure. What is pleasure? What is happiness? What are the differences between them? I think here he's talking about pleasure almost like just like the dirty, like the dopamine, like the really rich fatty foods, the gluttony, the lust, the envy, all these bad things that oftentimes feel good at some level. Like, the reason I go through social media is because it gives me little dopamine boosts. But, I don't think so. Anyway, we could have a whole conversation about what pleasure entails, because maybe we just find pleasure as something like where you do feel that deep-seated, tranquil, peaceful joy. So anyway, we can kind of table that for now. And then he has this other line too, where he just breaking down this relationship between virtue and pleasure. He says, there are people, in fact, who are unhappy but not without pleasure, nay, are so on account of pleasure itself. And I think this is just a great sentence that just describes addiction. There are people who are unhappy but not without pleasure, right? When you shoot up meth, the way people describe it is it feels euphoric, it feels amazing, you're flooded with pleasure, right? But you are still genuinely unhappy, and in fact, you are unhappy on account of the pleasure itself. Right, you are a slave to the pleasure. I think that's a great way of describing what addiction is. And going on here, he says, virtue often lacks pleasure and never needs it. Virtue is something lofty, exalted, and regal, unconquerable and unwearied. Pleasure is something lowly, servile, weak, and perishable. Virtue you will find in the temple, in the forum, in the Senate house. That no longer applies. That's one thing that did not transfer over from 2,000 years ago. Although there was also corruption back then, and at its in its ideal form, virtue should be found in the Senate House, but you will find her standing in front of the city walls, dusty and stained, and with calloused hands. Pleasure you will more often find lurking out of sight, around the public baths and the sweating rooms, and the places that fear the police. Soft, enervated, reeking with wine and perfumed. So, just again, and this too is where I kind of get what my definition, what is virtue? He's comparing, right? Virtue is this. It's exalted. It's lofty. It's like the highest kind of ideal. I get intuitively what he's saying there. Pleasure, on the opposite hand, is servile. It's weak. You'll find it hanging around the bathhouse, which is just, again, kind of like, hilarious. Whereas you see virtue, with calloused hands, putting in work, having a strong work and moral ethic. That's like this cloud, this general idea of virtue. But yeah, it was that was funny. It didn't carry on, but at the same time, it's also true because Cicero has so many what do you call like, it's the word where you, like, polemics, that's what it is, against people being corrupt in ancient Rome, and that's arguably like the fall of ancient Rome. So corruption also was true back then, and these things happen in cycles. But I love this line: pleasure is extinguished just when it is most enjoyed. And I might take this opportunity to pull out one of the other readings. So pleasure is extinguished just when it is most enjoyed, which is so true. Like, it's like this is kind of a silly example, but you start eating chips, you can't have just one. The second you get that, you want another one. You want more and more. Pleasure begets pleasure, and that's one of the things that's wrong with it. And so I have this quick little line from the Republic, which I thought lines up very well with this. So for these people who have desires and want more and more, there will be a formidable extra crop of desires growing day by day and night by night and needing satisfaction. When these sources fail, his large brood of fierce desires will howl aloud, and he will inevitably be stung to madness by them. Right? Once you get at this level where you just become so used to pleasures, that becomes like your baseline. For one, there's this formidable extra crop growing day by day and night by night, and they need satisfaction. And yet, once those fail, as he says, you will be stung to madness by them. They will make you howl aloud. So, again, just that idea, right, of as Seneca says, pleasure is extinguished just when it is most enjoyed. It always demands more. And in fact, there's like a line from The Picture of Dorian Gray where Lord Henry says, he describes the cigarette as the perfect form of pleasure. He says, because it's exquisite and leaves you unsatisfied. So so that's just totally in line with this. Again, you want more. It's never quite enough. And this is why people are driven to, true depravity. And I think this is where we'll talk about this at some point too. But something like billionaires, these people who just go more and more lavish and extreme to the point where they just have, like $100 billion yachts, just absolutely absurd limits of basically, toys, in a sense, pleasures, because they just set the bar higher and higher and higher. And when you have no limit, that's what this pleasure, right? As he says, a new crop grows day by day. That's what it looks like when you have unchecked resources and you just have somebody who does not have a good, control of themselves. Here, I'm gonna turn myself down a little. I think it's going red. So, okay. Just another great little line. The ancients have enjoined us to follow not the most pleasant but the best life, in order that pleasure should be not the leader but the companion of a right and proper desire. For we must use nature as our guide. She it is that reason heeds. Therefore, to live happily is the same thing as to live according to nature. So again, these kind of like vague words and definitions that we've been using, but I think we've kind of done a little bit of work to flesh out, and we can just kind of use the context clues here. But right, not the most pleasant, but the best life, right? Not the one that's full with the most pleasures, but the one that is genuinely most fulfilling and satisfying, right? Pleasure should not be the leader, but the companion of a right and proper desire. And as we shall see, virtue and pleasure do have a relation. But, there is, one has priority over the other, essentially. Virtue does not need pleasure, and it may kind of attend itself to virtue, but that's not the thing that is most vital. So, there we go. Here, I'm taking another sip of tea. Hope you guys are enjoying this. I'm having a good time so far. Okie doke. Oh yeah, let's see. Okay, we got the unchecked limits are a major problem I see. You see it in food, money, sex. The Tao Te Ching also talks about the dangers of overindulgence. Yet another example of how these philosophies around the world throughout time converge. And yeah, exactly, right? You do see it. This is also like almost my lay theory about, because you know how like billionaires are like weirdly into like just weird sex stuff, like minors and just weird like, you know, kinks and stuff like that. I almost feel like it's and this is something Plato even talks about, like at some point it's going to reach such a pitch that it becomes like, you know, morally corrupted. And I almost feel like when you just have access, you need more and more novelty and maybe like, you know, deviancy or something like that to bring it out. It's like, because why is it the case? I mean, I guess there's pedophiles everywhere, but there does seem to be this relationship between like, you know, excessive wealth and, you know, being like running like a hamster on that wheel of samsara that leads you just into very dark territories. And I think for all these reasons that we're talking about here. Right. So if we let them serve, not command, thus and thus only will these things be profitable to the mind. Let a man not be corrupted by external things. Let him be unconquerable. Let him be the molder of his own life. So again, just, you know, very much in line and supporting the kind of ideas we've been talking about. And then reason, when it has regulated itself and established harmony between all its parts and, so to speak, is in tune, has attained the highest good. For no crookedness, no slipperiness is left to it, nothing that will cause it to stumble or fall. Whatever it does will turn out to be a good. And this to me is the kind of almost coming back to that first part of the essay, right? What is the destination? Like, where exactly are we going? This idea, you know, once you have a harmony between all your parts and you're in tune with your soul, so to speak, have you attained the highest good. No crookedness, no slippery list left to it, nothing that will cause it to stumble or fall. Your foundation is solid. And once you have a solid foundation, especially when it comes to, you know, happiness and virtue and all these other things we're talking about, whatever it does will turn out a good. No matter what the wheel of fortune happens, whatever cycle it happens to be on, whatever your external conditions, when you have a internal, you know, solid foundation, anything that springs from it will also likewise be in that same line. Many of the ultra rich are probably quintessential examples of pleasure gone awry. I agree. I mean, this is true with it's not even just the ultra rich. I think they're like the kind of limit cases, but you hear of so many cases of, you know, like people that are just, you know, become famous musicians or famous actors. They devolve into like, you know, drug. That's like the number one thing is once these people get famous, they get addicted to drugs. And it's precisely because if you don't have this foundation, right? I think a lot of us actually might go down that road. It's just we don't have the means to do it, right? If you don't have like all the money to buy all the, oftentimes, you know, people would go out and buy all types of sort of like, you know, pleasure, drugs, drinking, women, you know, all that good stuff. Not good stuff, actually. You understand what I'm saying? But they just don't have the means. But once you have like unlimited money, and you don't even have to be ultra rich, you could be some, again, like famous like rock star or just famous athlete or just any of these situations. Oftentimes, then when you don't have that philosophical discipline, you will completely spiral into, you know, the all the different cases that we see in the modern day. Okay, so now he's going to talk about basically another objection, and I love this too. It's almost like Socratic dialogue. Like these are, you know, literally like you have lines that are in quotes, you know. But even you, it is retorted, cultivate virtue for no other reason than because you hope for some pleasure from it. So that's like that's another idea. You know, people only do. And this is an interesting thought to me, right? Do we pursue, like the reason we do virtue, even in a way, like when Copernicus gets burned at the stake, there is an argument that like obviously that's horrible suffering, but the pleasure, it's like a higher pleasure. I mean, this is what I think this is the difference, I think. Like Seneca would call that a virtue, but there is a certain pleasure of the soul, you could say, in pursuing things like truth and goodness and art. Like when I read a fantastic book or I'm working on some creative pursuits, when I'm oftentimes engaging in some virtuous thing, often, you know, virtue, I'm saying that like in, you know, generally speaking here, oftentimes that is attended by a pleasure. So this is kind of the critique. The only reason you actually cultivate virtue is because you do get some kind of pleasure from it. And so he'll answer that, but I see some in chat. So, which is why we build the internal satisfaction, and just being content with what you have is so important. Obviously, chase your dreams and all that, but never lose sight of what's really important. Yes, exactly. How is it possible to have a completely selfless act? Yeah, so there's a couple good ideas. I mean, one, again, this washing toad, to your point, this is why philosophy is so important. And it's ironic because it gets ridiculed as being like, oh, totally useless. That's just philosophy. That's just, philosophers are like a caricature of just of uselessness. But this is exactly why it's so important. If you don't have that internal satisfaction, if you don't have that stability, you're going to be, like he says, tossed around by the discordant cries, like Schopenhauer, blowing around like newspaper in the wind. And then once you do achieve, if you do, chase your dreams, if you do reach success and stuff like that, you can use that. You use pleasure. There's even there's a line, I don't know exactly where it is, but it's like, you are bound by pleasure, I use it. And you can kind of, utilize those kinds of things in a way that's actually productive, not where it owns you. And then cool cult, as to your comment, this is something I often think about, and I think it comes down to just the way you this is why definitions and stuff kind of are important. What is pleasure? Because as he's going to go on to say, Epicurus is all about pleasure, but the way he defines pleasure is so narrow and so lofty that it might as well just be virtue. But yeah, this idea of a selfless act, even when you do something, completely in a way that is directly kind of like objectively at harm to yourself, the reason you're ultimately doing that is because there might be some deeper, more underlying, selfish reason. The reason you if you're starving and you give your food to your hungry kid, right? That's worse for you. It's a selfless act, but then at the end of the day, is it selfless? Because in a certain way, you are doing that because there's just a more overriding kind of selfish interest, which is the love for your child, or anything like that. And there are levels to this, but yeah, that is an interesting question throughout this essay. What is selfishness here? What is selflessness? So. And that's what this person is saying right here, right? You cultivate virtue for no other reason than because you hope for some pleasure from it. Seneca answers this by saying, even though virtue is sure to bestow pleasure, it is not for this reason that virtue is sought. And then I love this image here. As in a plowed field which has been broken up for corn, some flowers will spring up here and there, yet it was not for these poor little plants, although they may please the eye, that so much toil was expended. These were superadded. Just so, pleasure is neither the cause nor the reward of virtue, but its byproduct. And, this is an interesting question. I think this is something Seneca would argue, that even if virtue was just, there was no, because he's talking about this deep-seated peace and contentedness and joy and happiness. But he's saying that even if none of that was there, even if virtue is always accompanied by suffering, we would still pursue virtue because it is a higher good. And if there are pleasures, which I think he does admit, right, there is this sort of, as he was just talking about, that deep-seated contentment. That is, if anything, like a little flower that grows from a corn plant, right? You didn't plant the corn so that you could get that little flower. It's nice, it's pleasing to the eye, I'm glad it's there. But we did it for the corn, right? For the substance, which is to say, in this case, the virtue. He even has this line to, I think with Stoicism, I don't know if it's him exactly, but there's an idea in Stoicism where it's like, it's this kind of indifference to external conditions, but it's like, all things being equal, yeah, I'd prefer to be healthy than unhealthy. But if I'm in some kind of sickness, I need to be able to bear that with nobility and grace, and in a way that I'm still content with myself. So, I think in line with this too, living a happy, good existence, that's great. That's a nice little flower, but it's not necessary exactly to the Stoic philosophy. And, I just love that image. The idea that pleasure is this little flower, which is great, but it's a byproduct of the sustenance, the food of the soul, which is corn, which is virtue. Do you ask what it is that I seek in virtue? Only herself, for she offers nothing better. She herself is her own reward. And again, now we're still kind of starting to flesh out this idea, what is virtue in this case? We're starting to flesh that out. It's something that is good in and of itself. And this is what I mean by listening to, and it sounds cheesy, but the resonances, the intuitions and feelings of your soul. We oftentimes have situations in life where it's like, there's something that would be easier to do, something that would be like kind of better in some sense, but we know what the right thing to do is. And oftentimes, when you do the right thing, you do that because it's a reward in and of itself. Oftentimes you could say. The personification of virtue as a woman is interesting. I wonder if it's something typical of the time. Because they, only herself. Yeah. I don't know if it's like an actual personification or just kind of like, the earth is referred to as like, her and the motherland. But it probably is personified. I'm sure there's like some, deity related to virtue. Like, justice is personified as like a woman holding the scales, and she's blindfolded. So, yeah, it is interesting, too, that a lot of, like, the highest sort of principles are oftentimes, like, depicted as women. Creation, Mother Earth, justice, and here, in this case, virtue. And then he's just kind of describing these people. Those who are apt to be filled with your sort of pleasure are all the greatest fools. Their wickedness abounds in enjoyments, and they have a blind and unthinking devotion to one's own interests, dissolute luxury, extravagant joy springing from very small and childish causes, the degeneracy of a sluggish mind that falls asleep over itself. And I just love, like, again, the rhetoric is fantastic. It's like, these dissolute luxuries, extravagant joys, small and childish causes. I mean, he has a part later too where he's like, if you can, by the time you finish all your belching and snoring and just living in this life of degeneracy, a sluggish mind that falls asleep over itself. Because I like that phrase, a sluggish mind. Like when you do, like if you just watch TV all day, if you're on social media, if you just like pig out, get like junk food, like you do just feel like groggy. You just feel gross. You feel like degenerate, essentially. And this is the kind of things he's talking about. Like if you take those people to the utmost limits. He's describing, that's the kind of people that like your pleasure, right? Versus mine, who are the people who pursue virtue versus who are the people that pursue your kind of just base pleasure. And then here's that line I was referring to earlier. You embrace pleasure, I enchain her. You enjoy pleasure, I use it. You think it the highest good, I do not think it even a good. You do everything for the sake of pleasure, I nothing. And so there's this relationship, right? There is like this disciplined aspect to it. Like you can have, it's not like you need to rule out pleasure in your life, but the second that pleasure starts owning you, right? The second that you enjoy pleasure, you enjoy pleasure, I use it. The second pleasure starts using you, so to speak, that's when the tables have turned, right? You have become enchained by, and this is also the Buddhist idea, you can just absolutely get sucked into this so easily. That's even like the Siddhartha thing. And like in terms of the story, he actually is on his spiritual grind, and he's trying to just kind of broaden his experience. He goes to the big city, and at first he kind of thinks he's above it all. He looks at these people gambling, he looks at these people binge drinking, and he's just kind of like, oh yeah, like just look kind of condescending, and he partakes in it, but he never fully goes all the way. But time goes on, and eventually he finds that he has fully been sucked into the land of samsara. In fact, I might have the quote here. Let me see. So this is a point where for Siddhartha, he reaches a point where the pleasures have fully consumed him. So here, let me check the chat because I think I saw some stuff. If you pay close enough attention, you can feel yourself dying when in degen mode. Yeah, that's when the tail wags. Yes, exactly. When the tail wags the dog. There, you can have a relationship. No one's saying you need to give up pleasures, but there needs to be a asymmetry there, right? Virtue needs to be the base, and if the flower pops up, fantastic. But otherwise, we need to be still going for the corn. Once you start doing all this purely for those flowers, you're not going to have the sustenance that you need. So here's a point where Siddhartha reaches, he's just, again, fully in degen mode, as you say, cool Colt. And he kind of has like this epiphany. And so he had drunk much wine, and late after midnight he went to bed, tired and yet agitated, nearly in tears and in despair. In vain did he try to sleep. His heart was so full of misery, he felt he could no longer endure it. He was full of a nausea which overpowered him like a distasteful wine, or music that was too sweet and superficial, or like the too sweet smile of the dancers, or the too sweet perfume of their hair and breasts. But above all, he was nauseated with himself, with his perfumed hair, with the smell of wine from his mouth, with the soft, flabby appearance of his skin. Like one who has eaten and drunk too much and vomits painfully and then feels better, so too did the restless man wish he could rid himself with one terrific heave of these pleasures, of these habits, of this entirely senseless life. And then again later, when had he really been happy? When had he really experienced joy? And so this is again that period where Siddhartha completely falls, even though he was really on his spiritual grind before, he just falls into the trap. And, he just gluts himself, and he said his heart is full with misery, and he feels like spiritually nauseous, and with one great heave wants to just puke out all that stuff. I mean, there's a good analogy there with just like, getting too drunk. Like you drink and drink and drink, and the pleasure begets pleasure. And eventually you feel like shit, you feel disgusting, and you just yak it all out. And you're hungover the next day. It's just a yucky kind of feeling. And this is what he's talking about, right? Pleasures are not the way, and that yucky feeling extends to so many things, and also in not as extreme forms. But in modern society, I think it takes the form of technology oftentimes, and stuff in media and stuff like that. But there is a sort of yuckiness involved in it. So and that's clearly not a good base for your happiness. And, Siddhartha goes on to have his whole spiritual development as well. Okay, where were we? Let me take a sip. All right, so this is what, Siddhartha in this case was somebody who was enchained by pleasure, right? He was not using pleasure. It was using him. So another line, there are many who are besieged by pleasures, upon whom fortune has showered all her gifts, and yet, as you must need admit, are wicked men. Again, this is another fantastic line, I think, too. And this is, again, kind of comes to the conversation with, like, the billionaire. These people who, by all accounts, fortune has showered them, almost against reason, right? Fortune has showered them with all their gifts. And this is true, like, back in this essay and other things, of, like, world leaders and kings who have everything they could possibly want, and yet they are wicked men. They are not fundamentally happy. If you look at someone, like, do you think Elon Musk is a happy person? Just the way in which we've seen him behave in the past few months. Richest man in the world. Fortune has showered all of her gifts, externally at least, onto this man, and yet you cannot see a more degenerate and depraved person in the entire world, right? He's a perfect example of, like, a wicked man in this case. It's in everything, bro. Even water. LOL. Too much will mess you up. Damn, I haven't read Siddhartha. I have it on my shelf. It's a quick read. I think it's a fun little spiritual book. Goes through, like, the whole life of this person. I think it's absolutely worth the read, especially with, like, if you're into this spiritual stuff. So these are living in the midst of pleasures, and yet it will not be well with them, because what they delight in is not good. That's another great line. These billionaires who pride themselves on just capitalism and the display of wealth, like just having bigger and bigger houses, bigger cars, bigger yachts, right? Just taking these to the extreme limits. Even though they are living in the midst of these pleasures, which are supposed to be good, in which the majority, right? If you ask the average person on the street, what would make you happy? Being rich and being famous. And yet it's those same people, when they have all those things, that even though they're immersed in what appears to be good, they are not actually well, because what they delight in is not, in fact, good, right? There's no spiritual base to that. Hell no, LOL, that's why he has so many personal problems. Yeah, exactly. Like, it gets to a point where you genuinely start to pity the guy, and yet by all external accounts, he should be the one, and he should be, if we talk about happiness as being rooted in, like, wealth and material things and consumerism and having the biggest whatever it is, right? He should be the happiest person in the world, and yet clearly he's not. And, these people who are in this state of pleasure, while in that state, they lack all pain, right? Like, if you do indulge in this, you might lack pain in a certain sense. They no less lack a sound mind. They make merry in madness and laugh while they rave. But the pleasures of the wise man are calm, moderate, almost listless and subdued, scarcely noticeable inasmuch as they come unsummoned. Again, this distinction, this comparison. The person who's immersed with pleasure, like, yeah, sure, at a certain level, they might not feel pain. Like if you do like meth, or, there's obviously less extreme examples of that. You don't feel pain necessarily, but they lack a sound mind. They make merry in madness and laugh while they rave. These are like people that are just low key, crazy, in a frenzy with pleasure. Someone does some cocaine, I bet it feels really good. I bet they're not feeling pain, but they're fucking tweaking out, right? And again, you can have different levels. This is on different scales. But when you compare that to the real pleasure of the wise man, they are calm, moderate, scarcely noticeable inasmuch as they come unsummoned. This is the pure peacefulness, the contentment that you see radiating from these people, from like, the Buddha, or people who just in real life who have dedicated years towards meditation and spiritual enrichment and things like that. You can just sense it. Like I know it's corny, it's unscientific, but they really do give off like a sort of aura of exactly what he's talking about. The wise man is calm, moderate. This is even related to mythology. The archetype of the wise old man is exactly that. They are completely in control, and yet they are also deeply content, deeply at peace, and you would say that they're happy. And this is in stark contrast to the person who's, wilding out on whatever it is, the pleasures that are otherwise afforded. If pleasure controls you, is it even pleasure anymore? Inedible goal. Yeah. First off, welcome to the chat. And second off, I think that's exactly what Seneca says. These are people who are driven to madness by their pleasure. They're enchained by pleasure. And ultimately, it's not, this is why this is a prime example of why it's not a happy life. If pleasure controls you, you fundamentally are not happy. And this is the distinction he's been making the whole essay between something like pleasure and, real happiness, which comes from virtue and just being in accord, in harmony, in tune with oneself, right? When you're just getting blackout drunk every weekend, when you're eating bags of hot Cheetos, which, I'd be guilty sometimes. You're not in tune, right? You're not actually in the back of your mind that you don't feel right. It's not good. And as Cicero says too, you don't have to rule these things out completely. He has a great line where it's like, he's like, I don't get drunk, but I do like to get bedewed by a little wine. Like that's actually what he said. Like I do like enough to get bedewed. You don't have to give these things up and completely, but also like Buddhism, it's the middle way. All things in moderation, and ultimately you cannot forget what is the most fundamental base, which is this, what we've been talking about, of this idea of virtue. Yeah, so again, just kind of outlining all that. The man who has plunged into pleasures in the midst of his constant belching and drunkenness, because he knows that he is living with pleasure, believes that he is living with virtue as well. For he hears first that pleasure cannot be separated from virtue, then dubs his vices wisdom. So this is kind of this interesting idea of what I think is just like cope, like ancient day cope. They fly to a mere name, seeking some justification, and screen for their lusts. And this is kind of where we get to the Epicurus stuff, because there is a philosophy at this time where, pleasure is, if virtue is so related to pleasure, then again, every time I experience pleasure, it must be kind of virtuous. And this is just, obviously bullshit. As he said, this is somebody who's constant belching and drunkenness. They believe that because they're living in pleasure, that they are living with virtue as well. That's cope. Right? They say, oh, look, I am living virtuously because, I'm engaging in these pleasures, which is just, just BS. And again, kind of what we've been talking about. What is the nature of pleasure exactly? He says the teachings of Epicurus, and first he prefaces it with, personally, I hold opinion. I express it though the members of our school may protest. So he's already like, I know some of y'all might not agree, but he says the teachings of Epicurus are upright and holy if you consider them closely, austere. The rule that we Stoics laid down for virtue, the same rule he lays down for pleasure. He bids that it obey nature. So again, it depends on what how you want to think about pleasure, but clearly there is a difference, a quality and difference here. Like if you get drunk, or for that matter, if you're toking on the doobie too much, like are you happy? Like yeah, maybe you might say yes. I'm feeling like they're happy in some sense, but this is fundamentally different. This is of a completely different order of the deep spiritual enrichment and philosophical happiness that comes from everything that these basic Stoic principles. Looking for a sponsor and indulgence is so fire. Oh yeah, wait, where is that? Did I already read it or did I skip it? But yeah, exactly. They're looking for I mean, just like that phrase, they're looking for a sponsor and indulgence. That would be like this Epicurean philosophy. It's like, oh, well, this school of thought says that pleasures are actually good. So me getting blackout drunk and being gluttonous and eating all this crappy fried food, it's actually good, right? And they're looking for a sponsor for their indulgence. So yeah, thanks, Cool Cole, for pointing that out. Whoever applies the term happiness to slothful idleness and the alternate indulgence in gluttony and lust, oh yeah, looks for a good sponsor for his evil course. Yeah, okay, so I did have it there. And you know, I think this is capitalism to a T, in my opinion. You know, in a capitalist society based off capitalist values, right? What is happiness? It's having money. It's having good food, being able to do all these different things. But you know, if anyone who really calls happiness this going back between slothful idleness, alternate indulgence, and gluttony and lust, you know, these are truly unhappy people. And when they have this sponsor, like you said, Cool Colt, he indulges in them no longer timidly and riots in them, not now covertly, but from this time in broad daylight. And there's even this line where he's like, they've lost the one virtue they had, because at least before this kind of like self-justification, this cope came out, at least they had a shame for what they were doing. They were acting unvirtuously, and at least they felt shame for that. Now they don't even feel shame. They wear it proudly in broad daylight, as he says. And again, the more insatiable these pleasures are, the more they are satisfied. You know, the more you have engaged in these, the more and more you want it. Pleasure begets pleasure, like we were talking about. This whole new crop of desires, like with Plato. Come then, let virtue lead the way, and every step will be safe. Then too, it is the excess of pleasure that harms. So, you know, I love, let virtue lead the way, and every step will be safe. This is okay, so coming back to it, right? The first line of the first part of the book, right? As long as we wander aimlessly, having no guide, and following only the noise and discordant cries, right? We're gonna go in completely the wrong direction. But in this case, right, come then, let virtue lead the way, and every step will be safe. Virtue is our guide. That's what Seneca is saying. On the path to happiness, as long as we follow, you know, this concept virtue, which admittedly is a little kind of, you know, what it's not precisely able to be pinned down. But, you know, we're talking about this. We have an idea of what he means by this. And so long as we are following the guide of virtue, every step will be safe. We will know we will be on the right path, just as, like, you know, a ship navigator, if you're off even by a couple degrees, you'll end up in a completely different wrong place, like we were saying. You know, this is a way this is the North Pole of happiness, is virtue. That's essentially what Seneca is saying here. Let virtue go first. Let her bear the standard. We shall nonetheless have pleasure, but we shall be the master and control her. But those who surrender the leadership to pleasure lack both, for they lose virtue and yet do not possess pleasure, but are possessed by it. And they are either tortured by the lack of it or strangled by its excess. So, you know, that idea too that we were saying, the tail wagging the dog, putting the cart before the horse. In this case, virtue is, you know, definitively the one that needs to be leading the way. If pleasure comes, great. Otherwise, you know, that is still the path that we need to follow. And, you know, the people who do engage in pleasure, as he says, they lack both of these. They don't even really have pleasure, he says. They do not possess pleasure, but are possessed by it. And they are either tortured by the lack of it or strangled by its excess. So even these people who, when they do have pleasure, they don't ever really have it, right? They are owned by it. And again, this is what's interesting, because when we're coming back to the idea of this is what the majority would recommend, especially some, you know, modern day capitalist society, stuff like that. And it's just so clear. This is why philosophy is so important. If you take, you know, 5-10 pages to think about it, it's so clear that a life rooted in that is going to lead to just abject unhappiness and degeneracy. But, you know, that's something people don't give it the time of day. You know, I mean, I think this is why the essay was so influential for me. I don't think I'd really ever thought about what is it that makes a happy life, and this is just a great example of it, and has, as we've been talking about, so many banger passages that point us in the right direction of it. The more and the greater the pleasures are, the more inferior will that man be whom the crowd calls happy, and the more masters will he have to serve. Again, I just, I love this idea. The more masters he will have to serve, and in fact, the whoever the crowd calls happy, right? The crowd would call rich, famous people, all these celebrities, these ultra rich people, they would call them happy, but they're in fact in proportion to which they indulge in that stuff, they are actually a weaker, more inferior individual. And all right, we're kind of wrapping up here. So kind of towards the end, he says another kind of objection that someone's leveling against Seneca. So it's in a quote, what? Does virtue alone suffice for living happily? I love this too. This is like some stoic Roman shit, but like the capital exclamation mark, what? Wait, I can't, oh yeah. What then? Yeah, it's funny. Anyway. What? Does virtue alone suffice for living happily? And then in answer, Seneca says, perfect and divine as it is, why should it not suffice? Nay, suffice to overflowing. For if a man has been placed beyond the reach of any desire, what can he possibly lack? If a man has gathered into himself all that is his, what does he have of any what need does he have of any outside thing? But the man who is still on, okay, so I'll that's the second passage. But again, I love this. Anyone, if you have, hold on, first time chat. Oh, fuck you. It's fucking, hold on. Let me ban, bro. Let me ban, bro. Ban. I can block, man. I forget. Ban. There we go. Okay, sorry. I just had to. I'll get the hang of this. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, if you are independent, right? If you can find your happiness completely independently of pleasure and pain and the whimsy, this is also textbook Buddhism. This is the core principle of Buddhism. If you can transcend this endless wheel of suffering, which is inextricably linked to this wheel of pleasure, then what can you possibly lack? If a man has gathered into himself all that is his, what need does he have of any outside thing? And this again is what we were talking about, the ability to be at peace, and not only at peace, but genuinely happy, in the sense that he's been using it in any circumstance. What more could you possibly need, right? You have everything you could possibly desire in a spiritual sense within yourself. And again, this is not far off. Like with the light being turned off and groping for something in the dark, and meanwhile you've passed it. This is something accessible to everyone at all times. So just, great stuff here. And the final part here, he's talking about, the man who is still on the road to virtue. So he hasn't quite perfected it. And he's, wherein lies the difference here? In that some are closely bound, others fettered, even hand and foot. He who has advanced toward the higher realm and has lifted himself to higher levels drags a loosened chain. He is not yet free, but still is as good as free. And so this is, what's the difference between somebody who is on the road to virtue, a truly virtuous person, versus without? We can all be bound to different degrees by the chains of pleasure. Some of them, as he says, are completely bound hand and foot. They're completely fettered. And others, as long as you're making an effort towards that, even if you're not perfect, everybody sins, in that sense. Everybody has their deviancies from virtue. Even still, as long as you're on the right track, you may have a chain, but it'll be greatly loosened. And, ultimately you're not free, but you are still as good as free, right? You're still on that path. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of The Happy Life by Seneca. So much, true wisdom in these pages. This is the beauty of reading. This is why I also love Stoicism as a branch of philosophy. It's not just abstract nonsense that's impossible to read, and you need like a whole ass scholar to help decode what they're saying. It's like, no, this is stuff that is instantly and immediately true and insightful. And, again, between On the Shortness of Life, On the Happy Life, Cicero, other things that I've read by Seneca and other Stoic philosophers in general, this is the kind of stuff that I genuinely take with me in life. And I hope all of you have got a little something to take with you, even if just for a little bit, just a little change of perspective. But, so I love this branch of philosophy. Great essay. And so let me just catch up on the chat. Is it possible that overcoming challenges in our lives is also important to our happiness? Like meaning, without going through the shit, we can't really know happiness. Yeah, I agree. That's even something that comes with this idea almost like man's search for meaning type beat again. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if it's from that book or this line, but like we oftentimes get our pleasure, through the struggle. And this is almost just like a Jungian idea, and not even Jung. This is just a general principle motif of all mythology, right? Duality. There, you cannot have light without dark. You cannot have good without evil. You cannot, perhaps in some sense, have happiness without suffering. They are two sides of the same coin, and you derive the one from the other. So I agree. Is it a happy? This is something I think the Stoics would also agree with too. They kind of view anytime you have some kind of challenge in your life, that's an opportunity to help build the character of your soul. That's another kind of general idea. So overcoming challenges, yeah, I think that's this kind of stuff that leads to personal development and personal growth. So yeah, great point there. But here I wanted to let me take I probably should have integrated this better, but I wanted to read a couple quotes. So here's just a little passage from Seneca. He said, so the people who live in pleasure, right? These desires are the most horrible and repulsive things imaginable. The perverted intelligence of men who are animated by such feelings are competent to understand the material rewards, but not the penalties. I do not mean penalties established by law, for these they often escape. I mean the most terrible of all punishments, their own degradation. So these people, even though they can kind of like get away with it in terms of like the law, they don't realize the consequences for their soul, essentially, and for their own, the most terrible of all punishments, their own degradation. And then one last line here from the Upanishads that again I thought was relevant is here. Let me pull it up. Oh yeah, I love this image too. As a tethered bird grows tired of flying about in vain to find a place of rest and settles down at last on its own perch, so the mind, tired of wandering about hither and thither, settles down at last in the self, dear one, to which it is bound. So this is, Hinduism, but the bird flying about in vain. He says, or the Upanishads say that once you actually embrace the self, embrace the meditate, this would be related to like the virtue stuff. It's like the bird finally settles down to its perch. But until then, we are like a tethered bird who grows tired of flying about in vain. When we're chasing all these different pleasures, that's the kind of image, that's the kind of thing that we resemble. So like when shit hits the fan, instead of getting down on ourselves and thinking our life sucks, we should see it as an opportunity to grow as a person. Yes, that's absolutely what the Stoics would say. That's like the external locus of control. Things are going to go wrong in life. Shit is going to hit the fan. It's absurd to think that shit is never going to hit the fan. But what the key is the way in which you deal with that, right? You could either just mope about it, or you could view this, you can endure the hardship. And yes, as you said, Washington, use it as an opportunity to grow. Through hardship, through difficulties, we acquire character. And that's also how we cultivate virtue. There is no great virtue in making decisions if you're never actually challenged, right? If you are, and this is a Meister Eckhart, he's somewhere. This is the idea, the person who is most tempted in sin, because that's like Christian mysticism stuff. They are the person who is most tempted is in fact more worthy and laudable of praise, because they have endured more in that sense. So yes, just related to that idea. So yeah, there's more here. I think we kind of get the point. Just this, the idea of, again, what is happiness? What contributes to happiness? When we break down and go through all the main forms, all the types of things that the majority think, we find that they are completely devoid of any real substance. These are things that we display to others. These are not things that actually have worth within themselves. And again, we must go inward, as with kind of all things, as all these traditions say. And this doesn't mean ignore the external by any means. Sorry, loud car just passed. But go internal and find a stable and solid foundation for a happy life. So that's that, folks. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll kind of stay. If anybody has any final thoughts, I'd be curious to hear them. But yeah, I think it's a fantastic essay. Hopefully you guys got something out of this. I know that I certainly did, especially upon the reread. Seneca holds up to the hype. Yeah, that's my GOAT. This letter is half the story. Otherwise, I wonder if there is a good essay or book on approaching dealing with hardship and being stuck in pleasure. Yeah, I agree. I'm sure there is, and if we have suggestions, let me know. Do you think fasting also helps with this? I'm going to say, so this is related to something I've been reading in the Cloud of Unknowing and the selected writings of Meister Eckhart. This idea, I think, if that's genuinely helpful for you, then yes, participate in the fasting or whatever kind of practice helps you really tune into that. But there is a worry, there is a concern that people like I just mentioned say, where oftentimes these people will try and act devout. Outwardly, they'll be the most ascetic person. They'll lash themselves. They'll kind of act like they're in this religious frenzy. They'll fast for, 10 days and 10 nights. But oftentimes, these are the people that are furthest from God. And in that sense, he's talking about, the furthest from virtue. It's all sort of performative. They're not actually going inward in this sense. Oftentimes, right? If something like fasting really does help you tune into that, I actually did a whole video, if you remember, where I fasted for like 100 hours, and frankly, it didn't do nothing for me. But I know people, and obviously that's a practice for a reason. So if it helps you truly go inward, but I think the Stoic would answer that to something like if you shouldn't need to rely on fasting in order to still achieve this spiritual enrichment. Great letter, hit all the big stuff precisely. Nice stream. I remember you did that 3-day fast. Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I appreciate all you guys being here. Greatly value this. There was, I think, some great discussion. Oh yeah, for our next, here, let me figure out what it's called. One sec. I got the book right here. Hold up, I can't. I'm looking for it. I'll post it in the chat. It's what are we reading next week? Yeah, it's I don't know exactly. I think it's on the manufacture of consent. The manufacture of consent, but my version by Noam Chomsky, which is related because there's been a lot of protests that's been happening, and I'm gonna try and attend one this weekend, and with like at least here in the United States. But that's an essay I've wanted to do for a while. It just seems very relevant, and I think there's gonna be some very good stuff in that essay. So it's called "On the Manufacture of Consent" by Noam Chomsky. Like I said, I have like the reader version of Noam Chomsky. I don't know if the version will be any different, so I will post a PDF of my version in the Discord. But yes, that's what we will be reading, and then we'll go from there. But I think there should be some good stuff to talk about. I'm trying to get a wide range of topics here, and I'm realizing it's been a while since we've done the only story we've done so far is the Circular Ruins, and I would like to embrace more fiction as well, so we will definitely be doing that. But if you guys have suggestions or anything, I'd totally be open to that. Let me know in the Discord and stuff like that, and I'll try and balance it with stuff that I have available, and blah 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 blah. Anyhow, thank you guys so much for being here. Thank you yet again for another banger episode of the Big Nate's Reading Club, and I hope to see you all next week for Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best. Oh, here. What do you recommend for Toni Morrison? Like novel or short story? Novel, I would say Song of Solomon. Yeah, definitively, I would say Song of Solomon over Beloved. And I'm hoping to read that short story by Toni Morrison, Recitaf. So if you're interested, that's going to happen at some point. Not next week, because I think this one's a little more pressing. But if you want a good taste of Toni Morrison in terms of a novel, I say Song of Solomon. Short story, nice little bite size, then do Recitaf, because I think we will be doing that at some point. Okay, and on that note, thank you guys so much for tuning in to Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs.